Hello and welcome to the first episode of The Pulse, Regen Strategic's new election podcast, seeking to go behind the headlines and examine the issues driving our government and political system. My name is Patrick Gardner and I lead Regen Strategic's stakeholder engagement practice. We'll be kicking off our podcast series with a preview of the upcoming Western Australian election, where voting will open mere days away, all the way until Saturday the 8th of March. I'm delighted to be joined today by Libby Lyons, our Strategic Counsel at Regen Strategic. Libby's CV is as diverse as it is long, with senior roles in the resources, media and telecommunications sector. Libby has also held the role as Director of the Commonwealth Government's Workplace Gender Equality Agency between 2015 and 2021. Welcome, Libby.
Thanks, Pat. Great to be here.
Very good. So conventional wisdom almost universally suggests that Roger Cook and the WA Labor Party will be returned to the government benches. What constitutes an election success for the WA Liberal Party?
Well, clearly anything that's better than we have at the moment. But realistically, I think if we could get anywhere between 15 and 20 seats in the lower house, I think that would be success. I think that we need that success as a state. We've lived in a one-party state for too long. I don't think that's good for democracy. And so we really do need to see the Liberals and the Nationals boost their lower seat count.
What have you thought of the campaign so far?
I think I'm a little bit cynical about cash splashes. I think that we have some fundamental, deep-rooted issues within Western Australia at the moment, particularly in terms of health and housing. And I think that as a voter, I would like to see both parties focus in on those fundamental systemic problems that we have as a state. Economically, we are doing so well, we're carrying really the rest of the country. But let's focus on those systemic issues, those systemic problems that we have in our state, and don't go splashing money around for the sake of winning a few votes. Let's actually do something to really help all people, and health and housing helps all people.
So that sort of lines up with the way the last couple of weeks have run. We've seemingly had an education week to time with the return of school. We're in the midst, as we film this, of Health Week. I'm guessing energy and costs of living are coming in behind in the remaining weeks before pre-polling opens, so that cash splash might make a bit more of a feature. The message around housing affordability, the long-term challenges facing our health system, I mean, they are deep-rooted in terms of structural issues that need to be addressed, certainly not quick solutions or quickly patched up with the cash splashes. How do you see the opposition parties addressing that in the coming term of Parliament?
Look, I think that that it will remain their key focus. It has to remain their key focus because these are the things that are hurting people. The fact that you can't get an appointment with your GP when you might need one, that means a lot of people just aren't going to the GP too, I think. And the cost of seeing a GP these days, because there are very few that bulk bill. And, you know, I was listening the other day to the woman that heads up the Emergency Medicine Association or whatever of emergency doctors. And she was saying that actually that problem with GPs is not translating into the EDs. And so these issues will come back and bite us on the behind later on. If people are neglecting their health now, just as we saw during COVID, when people neglect their health, we end up a few years hence with bigger problems in our health system. So I think it will remain. I think we have to address the issue of attracting more GPs and specialists. The fact that you can't see a paediatric psychiatrist for 12, 18 months is appalling. The fact that if you need a hip replacement and you don't have private health insurance and that you have to wait for 6 to 8 months, these things can't continue, not in a prosperous state like Western Australia. So I think we've got to address those fundamentals, attracting more GPs, attracting more specialists, making sure that the doctors that we do educate here stay here, building up our centres of research for some of these specialist areas in health and working with our universities to make sure that we focus on those sorts of things. I think some of those issues are the ones that the Liberals will be focusing on in terms of health in particular.
How will the major parties characterise the last term of government? Mark McGowan 4 years ago or thereabouts was elected with an unprecedented majority, an outright majority in the upper house as well. How would Libby Mettam, Shane Love, perhaps some of the minor parties look back at the last term of government?
I think they'll look back and say that they did, as opposition, the best job they possibly could, particularly the Liberals, because the Liberals, not being the opposition party, have done, I think, an incredible job with very few resources. Libby Mettam is one of the hardest working politicians I have ever come across in my life, and I think her whole small team have worked extraordinarily hard with very few resources. So I think they'll look back on it positively by saying they did the very best job that they possibly could. In terms of the Nats, I think they need to have a good, long, hard look at themselves and decide, where they sit on that.
Yeah, the changes to the upper house system, the way those votes will work their way through to seats in Parliament, that would seemingly have a big impact on the Nationals in particular. So they seem to have thrown their lot into retaining that formal title of the opposition party, but also campaigning and have candidates standing in metropolitan seats that probably aren't used to having a National on the ticket. Do you see that as playing a part in the result in a couple of weeks' time?
Look, it might in some seats, because it might split that more conservative vote. So I think it's a silly game in lots of ways. But, that's what they've decided to do. So we'll see how it does play out. I think in terms of the upper house, that's going to be really interesting. The composition of the upper house, I think, will be really interesting. And it will be very interesting to see what if any minor parties get up, or independents, and hold the balance of power.
Small quota now, so there could be a few that just tick over.
Yeah, absolutely. So that it will be very interesting to watch, and it may, in the long term, be quite hard to manage for any government.
Speaking of seats, we'll move to the lower house. Any particular seats to watch or any surprises that you might be expecting on election night?
Look, I think there are quite a few marginals, and I think that with any sort of reasonable swing, the Liberal Party will pick them up. I think seats such as, Albany, Scarborough, South Perth, seats like that, Dawesville and Kalgoorlie, I think they're definitely ones. I am very hopeful that the Liberal Party will win those. I think too, we've got to watch seats like Darling Range, Kalamunda, Murray Wellington and Warren Blackwood, because again, any sort of swing, reasonable swing, and I think they could tip to the Libs as well. So, and I think there'll be a few dark horses out there too that we'll need to watch.
It's never a uniform swing. The pendulum always takes a few out along the way before it settles again.
That's exactly right. And I think that from the Liberal Party's perspective, there are some outstanding candidates that have been pre-selected this time round. So if people vote on personalities rather than parties, it will be really interesting to see, personalities, experience, skill. Perhaps people are wanting a change. Then, I think there'll be a few dark horses out there.
So a more colourful, more diverse Parliament in both houses, much more likely following March the 8th.
Well, I really hope so, Pat, because I think you would agree with me that not really having an effective opposition is just not the way a democracy should work.
It's not the design of our system.
A democracy can't work. There isn't, in a one-party state.
There's a concept referred to as the sophomore swing, where newly elected members benefit the next time round from just being a face in the community. Do you imagine some of those seats that you listed, I guess, have been long-term holds for the Liberal Party? There was a surprise in terms of Labor winning those last time. Do you think that will have a factor, or do you think the tide that sort of moves them back to a traditional hold for the Liberal Party will outweigh anything?
I think that unless there's been a big demographic change in terms of the voters that the tide will turn back. I think that the last election, we'd come out of COVID extraordinarily. People thought that the incumbent government had done a fabulous job at managing it. We won't go there because I don't agree with that sentiment. So I think that there was that sense. And so there was this big vote for the incumbent government and all that they had been perceived to have done. As I say, unless there's been a big demographic change in seats, I think we will see voters go back to their traditional way of voting this time round.
Is there a particular voting bloc or key demographic that you think might have an outsized influence? I'm just thinking to the US election. There was clearly a big gender divide between those who were perhaps voting for Trump and those who were voting for Harris. That seems to have been a factor in recent federal elections. Are there some movements in demographics in WA that you would imagine start to have an impact?
It's hard to tell, isn't it? Because I would like to think that more than 50% of the population being women might look at Libby Mettam and say, wow, amazing woman doing a great job, let's give her a go. Unfortunately, we know that women don't vote like that. So I think that it will come back to, how well people are managing their money in their households and whether or not they think that giving the Labor Party another go again to try and fix things will be the main factor here. I really do. I think that Conservative governments manage finances better, but, the average voter doesn't necessarily think like that or hasn't over the last 8 years. So it will be interesting, but I think we will see Western Australians going back to the more traditional type of voting patterns that we've seen before. I think the federal election, though, when we get to talk about that later on, will be completely different.
So sticking within the borders for WA, but noting the other presence at the moment on our electoral system and even the state election is this looming federal election. How do you see that starting to bear down and have its influence? We've had headline-grabbing policy proposals and then withdrawals with things like nature positive. We've got an ongoing battle over energy policies. And as I said, that potential date for the federal election seems to be hanging over WA. How do you think that's being perceived by someone rocking up and voting or putting their votes down on a WA ballot paper?
I don't think the federal election or the looming federal election will affect the state election, but I think the state election will affect the looming federal election in that I think that Western Australians have known for 4 years that they were going to the poll on the 8th of March. They've been prepared for that and they'll go to the poll on the 8th of March. What they weren't prepared for is a federal election which will be within months after that. And I think that they will be a bit jacked off, that they've got to go back to the polls for another election. And I think that if, as many predict, the Labor Party win at a state level, I think people will say, well, we've given these guys a go at a state level. Maybe the alternative government needs a go at the federal election. I think that may well happen. And so I think that there will be a backlash for the incumbent federal government because there's a federal election so soon after the state one. People don't like having to disrupt their days to vote. And I think interesting, it'll be really interesting to see what happens in both elections, but with pre-polling, because I think what we're seeing at the moment is the environment is changing very quickly.
Yes.
And so someone might cast their vote as soon as pre-polling opens, but by the time the actual election day comes, they might sort of scratch their head and say, well, did I do the right thing there? So that pre-polling will be really, really very interesting because it will reflect that period in time at which they voted.
I mean, there's an assumption there that a hypothetical voter is genuinely unsure and they're willing to make up their mind either ways. But yeah, that conceivably could be a very different set of policies they go in and vote for at the pre-poll than what ends up being the set of policies and policy proposals.
But that's where the federal bit plays into that as well, you see, because because there are so many announcements being made, federally and state and whatever, that it's just a big jumble. And so different things will appeal to different people and different voters at different times. So I think it's going to be a fascinating few months. I mean, for people like you and me that love watching this and are involved in some way, shape or form, it's absolutely fascinating. For the average person out in Lord Mower land, I think that they will be fed up by the time it comes to a federal election. I think they will have had enough of the hype. They will have had enough of the cash splashes. And I think that will be reflected in their vote at the federal election.
So you perhaps can see why Roger Cook was quite quick to move any suggestion of an early federal date.
Yeah, absolutely. And also those initial suggestions that WA should perhaps move its date. I mean, no way. I mean, as I say,
it's the law.
It's the law. And we all know that 8th of March, we know that is the date for the election. So, which also happens to be International Women's Day.
Agreed.
So I have to mention that. Yes. Very important day for us all.
Of course. That secondary issue of the WA election. It's probably a bone of contention with candidates and members at the moment, because they're obviously traipsing through their suburbs in the summer heat. But that's probably another reason why they're getting a few blank looks or angry faces on the doors as well. For WA, Kate Chaney, I think, is the most marginal of the teals in Curtin. What are you observing, given that's your neck of the woods, and how is that going to play out with sort of the Grange Hermitage of Liberal seats moving in another direction last time round?
Kate Chaney is terribly popular with the women of Curtin. There's no question about that, and she has a very solid following. We have a really strong candidate in Tom White, and he has been extraordinarily busy and on the hustings for months now. And it was quite extraordinary to see over 600 people turn up at his campaign launch. Unprecedented, really. He has a lot of support. But don't underestimate the incumbent. So I think it will be very close, very close. And at this stage, I think it's too close to call.
And with our time zone, that doesn't mean just WA or the electors of Curtin will be focused on that. That could be a really critical outcome for the entire election.
But the way it stands at the moment, I think that there are a few other federal seats in Western Australia that are in play for the Libs at the moment. I think that any sort of decent swing, and the Liberals could win Pearce. I think Hasluck's still in play. I think that there could be a few surprises.
And seemingly a three-cornered contest in Bullwinkle, which is a new seat, thanks to our burgeoning population. But that seems to be a hotbed of activity.
Hotbed of activity. All the candidates there, from my observations, are working really, really hard.
And all with a good shake.
Absolutely. Matt Moran's a really strong candidate there and working extraordinarily hard with a great team behind him. So, again, it'll be very close, but I think Matt Moran will win that. No, that's an early prediction.
I'll note it down. It's in perpetuity now. We'll come back to that in a few weeks' time. So we've observed a number of formal weeks of the state campaign, but I think everyone's been calibrating their policies and lines for probably the better part of the last term, because no matter what any politician says, you're always having one or both eyes on the election. Looking into that next term of Parliament, irrespective of government opposition, what do you see as the policy agendas at a state level that we have focused for the major political parties?
Health and housing, absolutely. Cost of living. I also think that we have to look at, in terms of housing, this whole issue of infill and whatever. So I think that there's been a lot of steamrolling and bulldozing done since COVID, and policies and decisions have been foisted upon residents in different areas. So I think that they're...
Okay, so metaphorical steamrolling in terms of regulation.
Absolutely. So I think that, and I think, seeing the Liberal Party win back some of the more traditional seats that we've held in the past, I think those sorts of issues will come to the fore. And we've got some very, very strong candidates in some of those traditionally blue ribbon seats that we lost last time around.
I think it's the hardest job in politics, Leader of the Opposition, from my observation. But I guess formally that is Shane Love and the WA Nationals. Realistically, Libby Mettam and the Liberals have shouldered that role.
Well, look, I just think that they haven't shouldered that burden. The Nats might think that they have done the very, very best that they could under extraordinarily trying circumstances and with very, very limited resources. So you've got to give them A for effort in that regard, because just when I wander around, you mention the opposition and it's not Shane Love. So good on Libby and good on her team for really stepping up.
So the conventional wisdom seems to suggest that federal and state elections are fought on a very different set of issues, and as a result, you can't read too much into the results from one impacting the other. I just think, given the time frame we're dealing with a potentially back-to-back election campaign or potentially overlapping election campaign. In fact, we're always campaigning, so they're overlapping but getting to the end of their life as an electoral term. It's hard to see how the state result is not going to have some form of impact. And I think given the policy agendas around energy and decarbonisation, the nuclear versus renewable debate, you're seeing state ministers, Premier, opposition leader, they're weighing into a range of issues at the federal level just as much. So it seems like everything is being blended together. And I wonder whether that's contributing to some of that voter apathy or confusion about which issues belong where.
My view is I don't see that whole energy issue. I think it's gone away a bit in the last couple of weeks. What do you think? Do you think that whole energy issue is still top of mind for voters? Or do you think, as I do, that it's gone away a bit, or that it might come back, towards the election day, whenever that might be for the federal election?
I think it'll be an issue that's politicised by both sides. So clearly, the federal Labor and state Labor, from what I can understand, they think there's a role in demonising the prospect of nuclear power in Australia. And equally, I think there's a number of federal politicians that are making hay regarding the rollout of renewables and community concerns regarding consultation or impact to their amenity and their way of life. The question as to whether it's going to play a material role in the election campaign, I don't think it will. I think cost of living first, second and third, and then off the podium is issues around housing, the delivery of healthcare services. It's a fairly tried and true formula for Australian politics. But the policy battle, and that battle that probably is going to take place in both state and federal parliaments around the future of our energy system, that's going to have a really fundamental impact on our costs of living over the coming decades. So I can see why it's bubbling away and still retaining a good deal of interest from journalists and political observers.
So one other question, because I think this will be really interesting to look back on when we do further podcasts. So, everybody's banking on a rate cut next week. If there's a rate cut, do you think that will affect the outcome, the state election, or will that influence the way people vote at the state level and then following on from that federally as well?
I don't think the decision to cut interest rates potentially in a week or so's time is going to be a material factor. I don't think there's many voters walking into the ballot booth and thinking, I'm going to decide this based on whether my mortgage is slightly more or slightly less as a result of what Michelle Bullock says or does. What I think it will do is give both government and opposition at a federal level a little more room to move with regard to their policy settings and their commitments around some of those cost of living relief measures that are being flagged. At a state level, I think voters are wise enough to understand that's probably a federal issue. But again, it's not a bad pulse around the mood of the nation if there's a perception that things are easing slightly around those kitchen tables probably plays into the government's hands federally and lesser so at state level.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, though, that some of the major banks have already started to cut their own interest rates in anticipation. I think that's interesting. But I think the effect of any interest rate cut takes time to play out. And I think that people come the 8th of March and come whatever date, the 2 months after that, will still be hurting. Their grocery bills will still be bigger than they can afford. Their electricity bills will still be going up. And so it takes some time for those things to roll out into the things that affect everyday life.
No, that's right. It's no magic wand. I think there'll be a very quick adjustment of household budgets where any saving on the mortgage is going to be going into the grocery basket.
Or to pay the electricity bill.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
Thanks, Libby. That about wraps us up for today. We'll come back in a few weeks' time after the result and have a think about what the lay of the land is politically in WA. But most important, we can see what we got right and what we got wrong.
Indeed. Thanks, Pat. It's been an absolute thrill.
Thanks for your time.